Well, again, welcome to everybody who may be watching or live with us or the recording afterwards. On behalf of Short Answer and the Stanford Ed Club, we're very excited to welcome you tonight for our conversation on AI and assessment scales in the context of writing. My name's Adam Sparks. I'm the co-founder of Short Answer. So at Short Answer, we support writing across the curriculum by making it fun and easy to embed writing in any content area. And as a part of that work, we lead workshops with schools across the country here in the United States on how to adjust writing instruction and assessment in the wake of AI. And a huge part of those workshops has been AI assessment scales. So I'm super excited to talk to two of the world's leading researchers on that topic. And I'm going to introduce them more here in a second. If you want to find out more about the workshops that I just talked about or just Short Answer in general, I'm going to drop some links in the chat. If you're watching the recording of this, I will include the links in the follow-up email and things so that you can still get those. So that's Short Answer. We're also co-hosting tonight's event with the Stanford Ed Club. So Ed Club is a student-run collaboration between the Stanford Graduate School of Education and the Stanford Graduate School of Business that promotes discussions on pressing issues in education. So a huge thanks to Stanford Ed Club President Doug Phipps for all his support in putting this event together. And so to that end, a quick plug for Ed Club. Ed Club will be hosting a job fair later this year. And so if you're interested in recruiting Stanford Graduate School of Business or Education students for education adjacent full-time positions or internships, please fill out the Google form that I'm going to put in the chat here in a second. And we'll be in touch with you soon. And again, if you're watching the recording, we'll include it in the email. So let me copy paste that into the chat quick. Awesome. All right, that's all the housekeeping stuff. Super excited to welcome Dr. Mike Perkins and Leon Furze tonight. So Dr. Perkins has worked with schools and educational leaders around the world at the intersection of teaching, learning, assessment, and AI. He heads the Center for Research and Innovation at British University, Vietnam, where his current research explores the efficacy of AI text detectors and how AI can be ethically introduced into assessments, amongst many other areas. And Mike recently presented his work on AI assessment scales to the United Nations at the UNESCO Digital Learning Week in Paris. So we're honored to have him here tonight. Welcome, Mike. And we're also joined by Leon Furze. Leon is an educator, consultant, and writer. He's the author of the Practical Strategies series for educators, including practical AI strategies, practical reading strategies, and practical writing strategies. He's currently a PhD candidate at Deakin University in Australia, where his work with Dr. Perkins, he works with Dr. Perkins on the impact of generative AI in education and writing instruction. So please welcome me and doing, I guess, a digital round of applause for Dr. Mike Perkins and Leon Furze. How are you both doing? I should say, I was going to say this evening because it's 5 o'clock where I'm at, but this morning for you all, how are you doing today?
Yeah, fantastic. Great. Thank you so much for having us, Adam.
Yeah,
very much morning our side.
Yeah, so for context,
11 a.m. here. Nice.
Yeah, maybe just share the time and where you're located, just for context.
So I'm located in Hanoi, Vietnam, and it's a beautiful, sunny 7 a.m. here.
Which, for the record, Mike called really earlier on today, and I would like to counter that with the 5 a.m. wake up that my kids normally give me. But I've gotten away with it because it's only 11 a.m. here. It's quite nice in Southwest Victoria in regional Australia.
Nice. Well, welcome. And I really appreciate you wrangling these different time zones and making this work, because I think it's an important topic. I guess just to kind of ground ourselves in the conversation, can you give us a basic overview of the work that you're doing right now in assessment and AI? And I guess we'll start with Dr. Perkins.
Sure, thanks, Adam. So my work in AI started off with the area of academic integrity. So this is a field that I've been involved in over the last 8-9 years. And what I was exploring was looking at how the potential of transformer models at the time, like GPT-2, GPT-3, might have some sort of an impact on academic integrity. So is this, this dark tool that some students could access through OpenAI, if they logged in through various different ways, could they use that to help support them in acting without integrity in writing in assessment? And then I submitted this piece of work to a journal, and then the next day ChatGPT was released. So this was suddenly this big, huge uproar in terms of people being interested in partly this intersection of academic integrity and AI. But then this is, over the last few years, this has really exploded into a range of different topics for me. So I've been looking at how effective are AI text detectors in telling whether or not students have used these tools to actually write their work for them or to cheat. But we'll talk about that, I'm sure. Also looking at the impact of deepfakes. So exploring, do students and educators, how are they going to be affected by deepfakes in education? This is something that is new and expanding, and it's something that hasn't really had a huge amount of interest in quite so yet. Also, more broadly, looking at the kind of policy development around AI, I did a study right at the start of when ChatGPT was first released, and then 6 months later, assuming that universities around the world would have made some sort of a move towards developing policies towards using AI in education and in assessment more broadly. And then our study showed no, they hadn't. So 6 months later, there was nothing at the start, and there was nothing 6 months later. 2.5 years later, sure, we've got lots of stuff there, which is great, but it was really interesting to see how it took quite a long time for educational institutions to really move into this idea of what is the impact of AI in education. So that's kind of my general research area.
Right. And then, yeah, Leon, how do you come to this work?
So like yourself, Adam, I've got a K-12 background. So I worked in secondary education for 15 years, mostly as an English teacher, although I've taught pretty much everything except for maths at some point. I was a head of English, director of teaching and learning. And then 2022, I'd been having conversations with Lucinda McKnight, who's my PhD supervisor at Deakin University. She and I were both on the English Teachers Association Council for a while. We'd been comparing notes on these kinds of technologies. She's a scholar concerned with digital writing and digital texts. And I applied for a PhD studying with her under an ARC-funded project here in the Australian context, exploring the implications of technologies for teachers of writing. And so that's my wheelhouse and a really nice intersection of technologies. A little bit like Mike, I was talking about GPT-2 and GPT-3, and I wrote a few articles on my website about the implications of these paragraph spinners and things like WriteSonic and Jasper that were kicking around in 2022, pre-ChatGPT. The PhD got up and officially started in November, in the first week of November 2022. And then 2 weeks later, ChatGPT was released, and all of a sudden everybody was talking about generative AI. Right. So my studies are still focused on that kind of identity work with teachers of writing and the implications of generative AI, specifically on teachers working with digital texts. And as part of that, I've got my own digital text, which is my blog, which is my main form of communication. In about April 2023, I published a post with the AI assessment scale version 0, which was just a conversation starter, really. And Mike and some of his colleagues saw that, emailed me, asked if I'd like to contribute to updating that to a higher education context. And that's what led us into the sort of version 1, I guess, the most popular version of the AI assessment scale, which we'll talk about later. And then over the last 18 months or so, my PhD work has focused on a really small group of a community of practice with some practicing secondary English teachers, looking at their conceptualizations, their use of the technology. And I've maintained the blog, which is just kind of gone bananas. It's been really popular and really encouraging to see all of the engagement there. The AI assessment scale has gone global with K-12 and higher ed. And I can see in the participants list that there's people who've made their own adaptations now. I can see Adrian Cottrell from Australia is in the participants and has done some great work with his traffic lights model. Isabel Bertolotti over in Canada, who gave us one of the first French translations of the original scale. So it's been really great to see the impact of that from my perspective as an educator, as somebody concerned with digital texts and digital writing and the way that these texts can kind of reach a really broad audience and contribute to educator PD and professional learning. And then simultaneously to see the scale of the impact of the assessment scale and all of that great work that Mike and Jasper and Jason are continuing in that academic context.
Yeah, and that was how I found out about your work, frankly, was through your blog. So for context, I went to, it was called the AI Air Show was what they called it. It was this free AI focused K-12 conference in San Diego last year. And it was an individual from ISTE. I can't remember their name. I wish I could, but they were talking, and the conversation was context you just mentioned. It was English teachers and the particular angst that English teachers especially have felt in the wake of AI, because AI has upended K-12 assessment broadly, I would say, because just put simply, like just about any task we throw at a kid can either be completely completed or AI can help them dramatically in doing just about any task we throw at them. But that is especially true for writing. And you guys actually mentioned this in your research that I'll link here in a second. Like a lot of teachers I was hearing from were like, I'm going back to paper pencil, no more digital writing, like because AI can write for my kids, it's going to completely up it. Like none of my assessments are valid anymore. We're just going back to paper pencil. And it was in that context that they brought up at the conference in San Diego, your AI assessment scales, or the AI assessment scale as a potential solution in addressing like, how do we handle writing in a world, and especially assessment of writing in a world where a machine can now write for a kid? So would love to now to kind of deep dive into that. I think maybe it would be helpful if I pull it up for everybody. So let me share my screen real quick. And maybe, I don't know, whichever one of you wants to take the lead here and just kind of walking us through the basics of what is the AI assessment scale and how can it be used in the context of, in education broadly, but especially in writing. So let me share my screen real quick so folks can
Sure
see.
thing. Maybe if I give us some of the general broad strokes and let Leon dig into a few of the aspects of each of the different levels. So what we have is the AI assessment scale is now an updated two-part diagram. So the diagram that you're seeing now that Adam's showing you was kind of a response to some of the questions that we had, saying that we think that if you are putting level 5 in a hierarchical scale and saying that this is the way forward and the way that we should be moving towards assessment, and you should be using AI more in assessment. We said, well, no, it's not really the way. Adam, maybe if we could show the other diagram, and that would be a helpful way to sort of start framing that discussion. So what we realized is that very quickly, the genie's out of the bottle. We are not going to move back to a world pre-ChatGPT. We're not going to move back to a world pre-generative AI. And so we recognize that we've got to give educators and students some sort of a way to use AI in an ethical way. Now, what do we mean by an ethical way? Well, we're meaning a way that doesn't go against specific instructions that are provided to help support learners. And especially when we're talking about a writing context, we've got to do this in a way that supports assessment authenticity and validity. Not so much security, because I think as soon as we say you can take an assessment home with you, well, students have always been able to go away from assessment security. You give it to your parents, your dog, Google, Wikipedia, a multitude of tools that have always been able to help students cheat if they don't want to do the work. But what we wanted to do is to consider how AI could be used to support writing, to support assessment more broadly, and to get educators maybe to think differently about how they might wish to assess. So that's kind of the general context. We're saying that you can start off at one base level, which is no AI. And for some assessments, this is the level that you would choose. So essentially any assessment that you can provide to a student, whether that's a formative in-class assessment or a summative assessment, you would say, this is the level on the AI assessment scale where I would like you to target your work at. Does that mean the student's always going to do that? Well, no, not really, because Anytime we move away from this level 1 secured assessment where you are watching somebody with a pen and paper, and literally a pen and paper, not even just typing in on your laptops in a classroom, pen and paper, anytime you move away from that, you've lost an ability to guide how students are using AI or not. So if you can tell students, we would like you to use AI in this way, and some students will do that. Some students won't do that. What's important is that direction, though. It's the purpose behind the assessment. And I think that's one of the key elements that we're focusing on, is that it's not saying to students, we know that you will follow our exact words. It's thinking about these broad ideas behind why we're setting the assessment. So it's a conversation starter to have with students, because we recognize that you're not going to be able to prevent some students from using AI for purposes that go beyond what you're looking for. But it's a way to get started and discuss those things with students. Leon, do you want to take us on from there?
Yeah, I mean, that idea of it being a conversation starter is really important for me. The original version of the scale way back was a conversation. It was a conversation with educators that we needed to move beyond the binary ban it or allow it. You can't just have, we're not going to use AI for anything, or we're just going to pretend it doesn't exist and let them use it for every single thing. And we've seen other approaches to AI and assessment emerge over the last 18 months or so that have really kind of reinforced our opinions, which is that it is impossible to sort of police. It's impossible to limit the technology, and that's really hard. Speaking as an educator, that is so difficult to kind of front up and admit that this technology is out of our control, and that the methods by which we might try to control it in that no AI sense are now limited to in-person, supervised, technology-free or practical assessments. Now, there are some assessments that obviously preclude AI naturally. AI is not going to help you build a table or complete a sports exercise or anything like that.
Yeah,
but when it comes to not yet. When it comes to writing assessments, when it comes to any of those more traditional assessments, they are all equally vulnerable to artificial intelligence. And that was a hard one kind of realization for us in the development of this scale, in the kind of journey that this has been on. But it also acknowledges that the majority of our students aren't cheats. The majority of our students are not chronically cheating across every single assessment task. But there are reasons why they might misuse the technology, and there are opportunities for them to use the technology well. So we have to address both ends of that kind of that problem. The way that we're addressing using the technology well is by now thinking of the AI assessment scale as an assessment design tool, a conversation starter, as Mike said, a way to engage faculty and students in a conversation about the appropriate use of AI, and then actually to teach them that. I mean, one thing that we're seeing in a lot of research is that students are really confused about AI use. They don't know what appropriate use looks like. They don't know what's possible. I had a great podcast this morning. It was the MIT Sloan podcast, the management review podcast. And I shared it this morning on my LinkedIn. I can't remember even the name of the guy that was in it, but he talked about this problem of discoverability with AI, where because it's such a broad and general tool, we don't know what it can and can't do. Like, we don't have a feature list. It doesn't have a nice menu across the top where we can, click a button and it will drop down and say, okay, format our text in bold, or put it in underlined, or give me a heading 1 style. It's not like using a word processor. And in order to come to terms with that, the fact that we don't know what AI can do, I think we need to explicitly teach students and work with them in collaboration on understanding what the technology can do in an assessment context. So it's a really hard conversation, but a really important conversation.
Yeah, agreed. And as you both were speaking, my mind was going in 10,000 different places. So like one thing just on the cheating piece, there was a really quickly became well-known study from Stanford. It was just published in 2023 by Denise Pope and Victor Lee, who are 2 researchers here. they have been studying, or Denise Pope specifically has been studying cheating and baseline levels of cheating across K-12 contexts for a long time. And what they found was that with the introduction of AI, even though there's been a lot of fear about an increase in cheating and academic dishonesty, that they haven't seen that yet. It hasn't materialized. And I'll include I'm not going to dig through and find the study now, but I'll include it in the follow-up on the webinar today. And then the other thing, there's a researcher, and I'm going to mispronounce her name. I believe it's Sonja Bijlobaba, but we reference her work quite a bit, Leon, and what you just talked about. She's based in Europe, and her specific focus is on reframing academic integrity in the wake of AI as an explicit learning outcome that needs to be something that's explicitly taught in your class. Because so often we're telling kids, essentially we're defining academic integrity by what it's not. It's not copy pasting from ChatGPT. It's not looking off your friend's paper. It's not. So we're always telling kids what it's not, but we're never explicitly having dialogue with kids on what is it, and how can I act in a way in this class that would be acting in a way with academic integrity. And so something that I really love about the approach of the AI assessment scale is, especially Mike, on what you mentioned, is like it is a conversation starter where we can have explicit conversations in the classroom about what does it mean to act with academic integrity on this specific assignment or on this activity. So I think it's super valuable work. Now, at some point in here, you mentioned as well, so the scale used to be, I think, tell me if I'm wrong, but it used to be sort of a stoplight scale of, at least in my mind, like 3 of, if it's red, if I label an assignment red, it's no AI. If it's yellow, there's some AI. And if it's green, it's full AI. But you all have kind of moved away from that red, yellow, green labeling. Can you talk briefly about that transition more towards what I'm currently showing on my screen now?
Sure. So it wasn't quite a stoplight, but it was perceived to be a bit of a stoplight because we had a transition between red and green. Now, this wasn't actually chosen as a deliberate using AI, not using AI is bad and using AI is good, but it was perceived by some people to be this idea. So we had still a 5-point scale, and in the published research that we have at the moment, that's what our scale currently sits at. So in the links that you're going to share over, some people might be like, hey, but this isn't the scale that they were showing in the session. We've got different versions of the scale. So we used to have this 5-point scale, very, very similar to what we have. This new version of the scale with the pastel, with our bubblegum colors, was really a way for us to take kind of a different approach to making people consider what is effective use of AI. And Leon's got some great work here in terms of why we've moved away from the traffic light metaphor on the AI assessment scale. So I think I maybe let him talk a little bit more about that and the specific choice of the colors, because oh my God, we spend hours talking about the colors. Those are hours of our life which we will not get back.
Let's begin with how much time we spent on the colors, because I was traveling for conferences at the times, and we were doing a lot of this work with a shared Canva document and a Facebook Messenger chat thread whilst I was in 3 different airports traveling across Australia. And we were
I'm in Starbucks now. I've got 10 minutes. Let's do it.
Laboring over the specific hex codes of the colors. And we had a few reasons, we've articulated some of them in that blog post, and Mike's just gone through some. One was that the red, yellow, green was perceived as a kind of stop, don't use AI. Green, go, 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 use AI for everything connotations. And we wanted to move away from that because no AI has a place. Full AI has a place. Everything in the middle has a place. Also, we no longer see, if we ever saw in the same way, the AI assessment scale as an assessment security tool or framework, in the sense of, red means stop, don't use, punitive, we're going to catch you kind of rhetoric. We wanted to move right away from that. We also sort of broke up the colors a little just for accessibility purposes. We did a lot of work backwards and forwards with people with color blindness, and we had conversations with people with color blindness and tried to figure out the gradients between the colors so that they were all visually distinct. So there was that element in there as well. And we've ended up, as Mike said, with the bubblegum colors. And I think that they are a better representation of our thoughts, that all assessments are created equal in a sense, and sometimes the technology is appropriate and sometimes it isn't. And they also reflect, I think, our understanding of what learning and what assessment is. That learning is collaborative. Learning is something that's negotiated between the instructor and the student. Learning is something which happens not in a bubble, where we isolate the students away from technology for arbitrary reasons, but learning is something which happens sometimes with, sometimes through, sometimes against technology. So that's all kind of very highfalutin and educational theory, philosophy sounding rhetoric, but ultimately we moved to this color scheme, and I think we're all very comfortable moving away from that traffic light.
Yeah, and not just the colors themselves, but also the circular diagram. The circular diagram was really very new for the AIAS, because previously we just always demonstrated it as this hierarchical list. But sometimes people did perceive that level 5 we were saying was better, or that you're moving towards this goal of every assessment being full AI, which is really not where we think things should be, because there's room for every different type of assessment, and we've got to be able to recognize the potential use of AI in those different types of assessments. So every assessment is equally valid. And so we've got a whole range of different diagram images to show how educators can use level 5. And it just kind of pops out of the circle. And we say, okay, for this assessment, within our conversations, we're using this level 5. That doesn't mean it's better than any of the other ones. It just means it's a different part of the circle that we're looking at.
Yeah, and you're kind of touching on what my next question was going to be, like, because I think a huge challenge with educational research is turning it into practical policy teachers can use in their classroom on a day-to-day basis. And so, like, let's say I'm a 9th grade English teacher here in the United States. I'm concerned about the use of AI in my classroom. I recognize that once writing leaves the classroom, it's going to be really challenging for me to monitor its influence. So I'm thinking about maybe, like, I guess, how do I influence, like, if I want to use your assessment scale, how do I just copy paste it into my syllabus? And then do I start labeling a sentence by like color, depending on what layer or what level it is? Like, I guess, how do I practically implement this into like a 9th grade English class?
I'll jump in here because this is my world. And I work in my kind of consulting professional development capacity with a lot of schools as well. So I've seen schools now incorporate versions of the scale into their academic integrity policies, teaching and learning assessments. One thing that we always encourage people to do is to contextualize it. So, share it with the teaching and learning team, share it with the faculty leaders, have a conversation about the implications of the scale for your subject area. It started off, obviously, with my perspective as an English teacher, very focused on written assessments. And over time, and in the various publications, we've talked more and more about multimodal technologies and the implications of AI there. We know there are huge implications in maths and sciences with the recent advances in the mathematical reasoning of these models, their ability to use code and use other tools. I'm thinking like ChatGPT and Code Interpreter really opens up the scope for assessments in different disciplines. And so everybody's going to have their own response. We have made the scale, I think, as accessible and as open as possible. I'll pop a link in my side of the chat, and maybe, Adam, you can transfer it to everybody for the kind of design pack of the Canva link that we've shared, which is released under a really open license so that people can contextualize it, adapt it, and do what they like with it. And we've seen this has been really successful in getting people to contextualize it within their own disciplines. As a grade 9 English teacher, what I would do is take a look at my existing assessments, sit down with faculty or with my team, and work out just how vulnerable those assessments are to artificial intelligence. I call this kind of attack your assessments, which is maybe a little bit aggressive, but I think you've really got to get in there. You've got to use GPT 4.0 or even GPT 0.1 preview or Claude 3.5 Sonnet, the best model available, and just really smash all of your assessments to prove to yourself and the others in your faculty that any student with access to a reasonably powerful AI tool can do anything. and then have a conversation about what you're going to do about it. So are we comfortable with allowing students access to AI at various stages of this assessment, or do we want to do everything under no AI conditions, which doesn't mean exam, pen and paper, you know, that could be a conversation, a debate, group work in the classroom with the laptops closed. Anything like that is still fair game, but you need to have a conversation of, why is our assessment vulnerable to AI? Where do those vulnerabilities lie? You know, is it part of our assessment design that we can change, or is it a student-facing problem? And then what do we do about it, and how do we actually teach the students how to use the technology appropriately? Right. Something that Mike mentioned, and I popped another link in the chat there. There's a link to a Taylor and Francis published article called "Validity Matters More Than Cheating." Mike mentioned assessment validity, and this is a conversation that's just bubbling up in higher education in Australia at the moment. This article from Philip Dawson, Margaret Behrman, Molly Dollinger, David Bowd is being really influential in how I think about these conversations. But Mike, you've mentioned assessment validity. Do you want to maybe talk about this idea of validity versus security, or validity versus
Yeah,
cheating?
sure. So I think the initial conversation that people had and the concerns that people had when ChatGPT came out were about students are going to use these things to cheat. But we have to reframe that. And the AI assessment scale was always a way to sort of reframe things about students cheating with assessments, because an assessment is, even if students are using AI, can still be valid. So it can still test the things that we want students to be tested on, and they can still demonstrate their skills. But the way we have to do that is just slightly different. And people often kind of conflate these ideas of validity and security, and they think that the only valid assessment is one where students can't cheat, or it's not possible for people to cheat. And we've had some conversations with Philip Dawson about cheat-proof assessments, and how, in many cases it's really not possible. Even in an exam situation, you will always have edge cases, and Philip was, there's some very edge cases, but overall, we've got to recognize what assessment is there for. An assessment is there for assessment of learning. So we've got the learning and we've got the assessment. And we can bring AI into that, but we've got to do that in a different way. So the thing that Leon was talking about in terms of attacking your assessment, that's kind of the start of this conversation, because the next stage is having those conversations with your students. And for me, I would maybe even bring in students into attacking your assessment and say, hey, let's have a fun game. Here's something I was going to tell you, and something I was going to assess for you. I want you to do it all using ChatGPT and see how quickly you can do this. And the first time I asked students to use AI tools in a classroom setting, they all looked at each other and they were like, he knows about this magical tool that we're using to do all this work. I'm like, yeah, guys, I know. So we open up and we have this conversation and we say, look, this type of assessment is no longer really suitable for testing whether or not you've learned what we're trying to learn. So therefore, we're going to go into a different strategy, and we're going to use this AI assessment scale. So now you'll see, whenever I give you an assessment, you'll see this little bubble, and it'll tell you what level that is supposed to assess. But unfortunately, for educators, that means a lot of work. And that means extra work in a time where educators are already pressed for time, for professional development, for simply getting their material prep before their next class starts, because everyone's on an overload because chronically understaffed. But it does mean a little bit of a rethink. It doesn't have to be too difficult, but we've got to think about, how can I ensure that this assessment is valid even if students are using AI? And you've got to make that assumption that students are using AI. One thing I tell my faculty, I say, so it's October 2024. How do we know that? How can you tell whether or not students are using AI in an assessment that they've submitted to you? And people say, oh, the people are using the words like delving, or it's perfect grammar, or lots of different reasons. And I say, Any single assessment that you get will have been influenced by AI in some way. That's not to say that students are using it to cheat, but there's been an influence somewhere that we've got to recognize. So therefore, it's really on us as educators and on educational management to support the growth of this, to really allow space for assessment redesign. And that's something that, that Leon and Jasper and I have been talking about a lot. How can we redesign assessments in the age of AI to match up to these different levels? It's not an easy task. We've got a few tools we can talk about later, but this is probably the main step that we need to go to try and ensure that assessment validity without focusing too much on the assessment security.
Yeah, and so our last webinar was with Dr. Dylan William, who for my money is one of the godfathers of modern K-12 assessment. And he talked about that, of like, ultimately what's important is, what are you trying to measure? And to what extent does AI hurt or help what you're trying to measure in terms of whatever activity you're having them do, whether it's English class writing a paper or math or whatever. And to that point, I just put a blog post, and he was mentioned earlier at some point, but Adrian Cotterill, who's an educator in Australia, has a blog post that I think is fantastic on kind of what you're talking about, doubling down on what is the assessment construct, what is the thing I want to measure, and how best do I go about redefining that in the age of AI. Now, another natural question that I think comes up here, Mike, is why do I have to worry about assessment scales at all? How about I just tell the kids not to use AI, and if I think they use AI, I'll copy paste it into Turnitin, and Turnitin will tell me whether or not they used AI, and if they did, then I give them a 0 and I move on. So good to go. Don't have to worry about assessment scales. I've got my AI detection software. What would your response to that be?
Yeah, it sounds really easy. And for many educators, that sounded like the magic bullet. So when these tools came out, we're talking about March 2023, when Turnitin released their AI Detect feature. Prior to that, there were a few tools which were coming out all around the same time, getting a lot of press: GPT-0, Zero GPT, Originality AI, a lot of these tools having these AI detection tools. And for many educators, that was seen as like, oh, thank God. We've had a horrible 6 months where students have been using ChatGPT for everything, but now we don't have to worry because we can use these tools to detect and give a 0. Well, unfortunately, there are some quite significant challenges with these AI detection tools. And some of the research that I've been doing, along with many others, has really demonstrated this time and time again. Now, I am probably one of the few AI, Gen AI educators who, I'm not against the use of AI detection tools. I'm not saying that these are terrible things done by these big ed tech companies sent to destroy us, and they're doing this harm. So AI detection tools were a way to try and support educators to have conversations with students. And if you look at all of the kind of the guidance that these organizations have put out, Turnitin being probably a key example. I've had lots of conversations with Turnitin about this area. They said, look, this isn't a way where you just find out, it says 80% AI, and then you give a 0. It's a conversation starter again. It's saying, look, is this the way that we want to portray our voices in assessment? Is this your voice? You don't do it just because a tool tells you no. And a forecasting or a prediction tool isn't bad or isn't, terrible by its own very nature if it's not 100% accurate. So some people will say, well, it's not 100% accurate, there's a risk for false positives. Sure, weather forecasting has a risk for false positives and false negatives, but we still use weather forecasts. We still recognize that there is some use for them in a certain setting. We don't plan our entire lives around that, but we do recognize this use. But the main issues with AI text detection tools is that educators don't have time to have those conversations, and therefore they fall into this gap of, the computer says it's AI. I trust the computer because I've been brought up to, especially with Turnitin, Turnitin in terms of the originality checker, that is it is either matches a source on the internet or it doesn't match a source on the internet. So Turnitin, leverage this kind of trust that people have in their software to say, well, I believe that Turnitin says this, and then they believe that the students have used AI, and then they say, well, I told the students you can't use AI, so you get a 0. Yeah, and this is really an unfortunate area where the convergence of society and technology and teachers kind of falls into a bit of a black hole, because it's really these tools can have a use in the classroom and can have a use to have these conversations with students about how effective their writing is if they're using AI tools. Can they use AI tools to help support their writing? In my mind, sure, a lot of my writing is supported using AI, but where it goes beyond your own writing and it's all just AI, that becomes too much. So having those tools does help us see some of those things and help us have those conversations. And there's some more specific areas. You know, there's research, controversial research about whether or not these tools are less valid with non-native English speakers or speakers of English as a second language. Turnitin research says no, especially some of their newer tools. Other research says yes, it's kind of still an area that's up for debate. But really, the biggest problem is that if we make relatively small adjustments to the outputs of work produced by an AI tool, we can reduce the accuracy to a level where we can no longer say how valid this assessment is.
Yeah.
If we take a piece of text, copied and pasted from ChatGPT 3.5 or even 4, put it into Turnitin AI Detect, Turnitin AI Detect will do a great job of saying this is all AI text. But what student uses AI like that?
Right.
Only students who use AI like that are the ones who need our support. They are the ones who are struggling academically, so they keep things to the last minute. Maybe they don't have time or space to focus on their own schoolwork because of family situations. They're ones who have challenges with writing in English, and they're the ones who don't have access to the latest and greatest tools that can write in a bit more of a fluent way that is a bit more challenging to pick up by text detection tools. So the only things that we catch are the weaker students, and we say, aha, we've caught you. But then all the other students who've used AI in slightly smarter ways, they've tweaked the output, they've done paraphrasing, they've added spelling mistakes, they have made it appear like they have done the work, they don't get caught.
Yeah.
And that's probably the biggest challenge there. It's that we don't have this fairness in its use. It's not that the tools themselves are inherently bad, but the way that they end up being used in a classroom is unfair.
Yeah, and I just shared a blog post in the chat about my experience with the research and with the use of AI detection tools. And I think the point you're bringing up is right. There's a study out of, I think it's the Maryland Computer Science Department. It's referenced in the blog post that I shared in the chat. That backs up exactly what you just said by breaking up the by text. So, you know, they call it a paraphrasing attack, but it's basically just taking what ChatGPT gave you and rewording it. You decrease the validity of some of these AI detection tools by like 90%, because oftentimes I'm not a data scientist, massive disclaimer here, but these large language models are just stringing together text based on statistical probabilities. So these detection software tools are looking for those patterns that you would expect in those probabilities. So if you break up those patterns by changing around words, it's going to decrease the validity of the tool, which I think you're right, because it has the potential to have a negative impact on some students more so than others.
And Adam, can I just jump in as well and say that this is, you know, this is a human problem. This is not just a technological problem. So just about an hour before this webinar started, I got an email from a mother in South Africa of a daughter who'd been studying at a South African university, and the university had used detection tools to determine basically pass-fail. If they'd used any AI, or if they determined that they'd used any AI, it was a total resubmission. And I got an email from, I don't often get emails from parents outside of the education community, particularly not in different countries. But it was just an email saying, you know, what do I do? Like, my daughter's been told that she needs to resubmit her entire unit's worth of work, her entire final report, or she gets a 0 and she fails. She's panicking, I'm panicking, and the university's taken this really hardline stance on this. And I don't know if that student used AI or not, and frankly, neither does the university.
Right.
The validity of these tools, as Micah said, is kind of neither here nor there. We can tell to an extent if somebody has used them in a very heavy-handed way, and then it drops off very, very steeply. But the fact that this person is emotionally stressed out enough to send an email to some random guy in a totally different country who's been writing about AI and assessment and ask for help suggests to me that we need to treat this as a really sensitive and really important human issue, and not just a yes/no technological solution.
Yeah, and
so we've always got to bear that in mind.
Yeah, and in that blog post I've shared in the chat, I actually met with the head of AI at Turnitin, and this is a direct quote from him verbatim. AI detection tools should never be used to give a kid a 0. Like, you should never give a kid a 0 just because of a score kicked out by Turnitin or any of the adjacent tools. So I think that's important to iterate here. I think there's a question in the chat that I'd love to bring up now, and if you do have questions, please share them in the Q&A. Sorry, not the chat, in the Q&A. This is from an anonymous attendee on what we're talking about now. They said, I would tend to agree to your metaphor, and I don't know if you guys can see this or not, but just for folks that can't.
Yeah, I can see this one.
In the case of whether you have an immediate, measurable, tangible proof, whether the prediction is accurate or not, and we don't necessarily have that with AI detection. So, listening to you, I tend to agree with you. But do you think that the mere existence of AI detectors is just a shameful money grab?
Well, bit of a leading question there. And I can say,
look, no, you go, Mike. We've both had experiences
sure.
of working with these, or of being approached by these companies, I think, in various formats. So
yeah. I mean, I think for a lot of these organizations, the use of creating an AI text detector was filling a need in the market. The need in the market is that educators are crying out for support in how to deal with this deluge of AI submitted work that they're seeing in their own experiences. And as much as we're saying that, oh yeah, we can use AI in an appropriate way, a lot of students weren't using it in an appropriate way. A lot of educators hadn't set up assessments to do that. So this was a way to help support educators. Is it a shameful money grab? Well, there's free tools available. We've tested some of these. I wouldn't say that it's a shameful or a shameless money grab in general. I would say that Turnitin have now moved towards this being a paid for model. And a lot of the best tools for AI detection, as in the most accurate ones that have been tested by research, are all paid for softwares that many people don't have access to. The ones that are the least accurate are where educators who don't have a subscription might tend towards copying and pasting student work into an online tool which says, yes, this is AI. So yeah, there's some accurate ones which are paid for, and there's inaccurate ones which are free, which often get used. I don't think the existence of them in itself is a bad thing, but this is a society problem, and it's a how tools are used problem. Leon, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that really, and I'm very critical of ed tech companies often having sort of waded through 15 years of being bombarded by ed tech that doesn't work. So my perspective is, when you see a company that releases a tool for generating AI text, and then that same company releases a tool for detecting AI text, that to me suggests a certain level of cynicism and a certain level of money grabbing. Turnitin has always been a tool for academic integrity purposes. The fact that they're releasing and monetizing an AI detection tool is totally on brand for them. Now, you may have ethical concerns with how they collect their student data, or concerns with the efficacy of their tools or how it's marketed, but what they're doing is a continuation of what they've always done. You see other tools which are promoted as AI writing assistants, AI grammar checkers, AI whatever, and they also have AI detection tools and things built into them. I'm a little bit more cynical of those kinds of tools.
Yeah,
and of
very much
of the rationale, the logic, the direction behind those tools. But I think as educators, we know how to navigate these shark-infested waters. We've seen ed tech before. We've worked with big tech, small tech, free tech, paid tech. So, it'll all come out in the wash eventually, I think.
Yeah, and I would, so when this topic comes up a ton in the workshops we lead with schools, I default to the research. So Dr. Laura Weber-Wolf and a team at the University of Applied Sciences in Berlin did a pretty massive study of not just Turnitin, but all the major AI detection tools, and found that their validity is just not high enough to use in academic. Like a direct quote from the finding was, "These tools should not be used in academic settings." So I would default to that. So if you're a teacher listening to this, or practitioners, tools that we have recommended folks use are revision history tracking tools. So those tend to be free. The one that I just put in the chat was Draftback, which is in the Chrome ecosystem. Carrie, I saw your question in the chat about Draftback being a Google-oriented tool, and does Microsoft have one? I don't know if Microsoft has a revision tracking tool.
Microsoft does have a general version history that you can look at. I'm not sure whether there's a built-in, direct line for line checker in there. It would show you over a period of time, but it might not show you the ability if students have copied and pasted, sections of text in. I think, these are the alternatives, right? To, if I really want my students to not use AI and I'm want to invest time into checking that, how can I do that? And that's one of the tools that you might want to look at.
Yeah, I think revision, because there was another question from Cheyenne in the chat about Brisk, which is a very popular AI tool here in the United States. I don't know if Brisk is as popular internationally, but it's a Chrome extension that does some pretty robust version tracking. It's similar. So Draftback is a version tracking tool that's going to quickly play back a video of the student's revision history. So if you suspect AI detection, you can go watch the Draftback quick. You don't have to. The challenge with picking through a big long revision history, it could take you forever, right? So if you have a quick setup video, you can see very quickly if a kid copy pasted in some text. So for my money, like if you've set it the expectation, going back to your assessment scale of no AI use in this writing assignment, and you suspect AI use, I would encourage you up front to set the expectation of, you're going to do all your revisions in this one document, and if and when I suspect you used AI when you weren't supposed to, please turn in your revision history, whether that be through Brisk or through Draftback, or there's another one called Revision something, I'm not sure.
Sorry to interrupt, Ed.
No,
I
you're
just want
fine.
to jump in, because we can get really bogged down, and we do this in education, especially in K-12. We get bogged down in tools, and we end up with this kind of shopping list of tools that are available to do this job and that job and the other job. And I mean, I'm really, my research is concerned with the writing process as a whole. And so to step away from, do we have a tool that can do version tracking? Do we have a tool that can do detection? Do we have a tool that can do X, Y, and Z? And think about that whole process of writing and what that looks like, and treat that as valid for the students. I think it's something we'd always got to come back to. So, you mentioned version tracking and copy pasting and things. That would 100% detect most of my blog posts as problematic, because I write most of them verbally, transcribe the audio, take the audio transcription raw into Claude, edit it and tidy it up in Claude, copy and paste it into WordPress, and then manually do the final edits and revisions. My work is getting flagged 100% all the way through that journey. And, that could be an accessibility feature for some students, the ability to write verbally and to work in that kind of fashion. It could be whatever. So I just want to, and I guess this is
a lack of internet connectivity at times, and students were having to work offline, working on a tablet, working on a home computer and transferring that over. We see this all the time as challenges.
And so what we've got to be cognizant of, I think, all the way through, is that we can have this kind of solutions focused mindset in education sometimes of, oh, here's a problem, what's the tool that's going to fix it? And the technology companies certainly present themselves to us in that way. And I think we need to reframe a lot of these conversations around, what's the teaching and learning happening here? How does that happen along that journey? Which tools are appropriate at different parts of the journey and which aren't? And how are we going to take the whole into account rather than just kind of picking out points? Yeah. So sorry to interrupt, but it's something that I'm really
I'm glad that
passionate about in my own writing.
No, me as well. And that's been, so short answer, I mean, I am an ed tech creator. I want to name that, but I'd like to think we grew out of the learning design and technology program here at Stanford. And the philosophy there is very much, what is the problem? Like, let's not start with, and I think that's been a challenge with AI. It can do all these cool things. It's easy to start with the solution of, look at all these cool things it can do. How could we use it in these different contexts? I think we need to double down on, what's our problem? What does research say is best practice in solving that problem? And then how can technology potentially help us actualize that research to actually solve the problem? So now to the point of Lynn Herr, who I'm glad that you hear Dr. Hurd, as Lynn Herr was a teacher of mine when I was teaching in Nebraska. I'm glad you're here. She's talking about how there's a Chrome extension called Revision History that combines version history and draft back. So I'll include that in the follow-up resources for this chat. I think, we've got time for maybe one more question, and Laura Hurtado had a question I think is a good one to end on. She said, if you could recommend some steps to start implementing AI in schools, what would they be? So maybe one step if you're thinking about AI implementation in schools.
I always begin by looking at what you already have and working from there. So schools have a lot of policies. They have a lot of cyber safety, digital assessment, teaching and learning, academic integrity. We don't have to throw everything out of the window just because AI's come along. It's an evolution of technologies that we've been working with. We don't need to invest heavily in lots and lots of new technologies because a lot of what we already have does what we want it to do. So do a really clear, really open, really honest audit of what you already have on the ground in the classroom in terms of teacher expertise, policy, and so on, and then start to build in from there. Don't treat it as this kind of new thing that's just come along and walloped everybody and we need to jump on board straight away. So yeah, that's my kind of step number one. Take stock of where you're at right now and then talk about where you move from there.
For me, I would say that having a consistent policy across an institution as well is really important. Don't force this on individual educators to have to make up their own policies on how they're going to use AI in the classroom. This is something that should be done at a high level, and there should be effective training to the educators themselves. This is how you use AI. This is how you might use AI in your classroom. And this is how you might talk to students about using AI in your classroom and in your assessment. What we've seen is that when there's an individual discussion, students get huge amounts of confusion. Some educators might say, this is what I want, and this is the only way, and this is the right way. And then they turn up to the next class, and the next teacher says, this is the way, and this is how I want you to act in my class. So I think having some consistency for students and therefore institutional policy is a really big stepping point towards being fair and inclusive to all students and all subjects.
Yeah, sure. Well, we're coming up on time, so I just want to say, first of all, thank you both for joining us and sharing the research. As I've said repeatedly throughout this webinar, in the follow-up email, we'll include a link to the recording, first of all, and a transcript of it. But then also I'm going to do my best to try to cite and share links to all the different resources we talked about, whether it be EdTech tools or research and things like that. Is there anything else before we go, Dr. Perkins or Leon, that you'd like to share, or any final thoughts before we jump off?
I think having an open mind to how AI might help students learn is going to be really useful as we move forward. We're only at the beginning of this, seeing AI engage into education. And there's going to be some really interesting developments that will require us to reframe what we thought was normal and normal practice. And this is going to take some time. So we've just got to have an open mind to that and not be so restrictive in, well, this is the way we've always done things. So thinking about the future, thinking how we can help our students.
And my parting shot is just to celebrate that really global community that's come around resolving all of these problems. I mean, you're in the US, Mike's in Vietnam, I'm over here. Mike and I are both from the UK, and we've worked with schools all over the world who are all addressing the same problems. And so just kind of celebrating that and the way that the education community, K-12, vocational education, adult education, higher education, has really come around and coalesced around this problem and is coming up with some really fantastic ideas.
Yeah, it's a global challenge, and I think that international comparative perspective is super valuable, as is evidenced by this conversation. So we'll leave it there. I appreciate all of you for joining us, and please, at Short Answer and Stanford Ed Club, we're going to continue to do webinars like this on pressing issues. So let us know what you might want to talk about next, and otherwise, we'll see you next time. Thank you.